Hey guys, tonight we're slipping off our sneakers and sliding back into a time when the wrong shoes could get you kicked out of the emperor's court, literally. You stand under the looming shadow of Han Dynasty grandeur, staring up at tall wooden gates lacquered in deep vermilion. The sky above you is soft with early morning mist, and the capital Chang'an is just beginning to stir. But inside the palace walls, it's already a silent war zone where decorum is law, and your footwear might just get you executed for disrespect. You shift nervously. Your feet make the tiniest squeak. You freeze. Somewhere in the courtyard, a low-ranking official turns their head slightly, just enough for you to notice. You're wearing the wrong shoes and everyone knows it. The tension thickens like kanji left on the stove too long. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me your location and the local time right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Han Dynasty, reigning from 206 BCE to 220 CE, was one of the most sophisticated civilizations of its time. With sprawling bureaucracy, a structured court, and innovations in everything from papermaking to astronomy, the Han elite took their rituals very seriously. The palace itself was a finely tuned instrument where every shuffle, every glance, every syllable held weight. And then there's you stomping in like an untrained yak with your novelty-sounding shoes. But how did things get this dramatic? Let's back up. Early Chinese footwear was generally soft. Think hemp sandals, leather soles, maybe even wool for those high-altitude folks. People weren't stomping around in platform clogs like a fashion show in Kyoto. But over time, status began seeping into soles. By the time of the Han officials, especially those higher up, started wearing more elaborate shoes. Some were stiff-soled, lacquered, or reinforced with materials that made, well, a noise. Not a thunderclap, exactly, more like a discreet meep with every step. Here's the thing, squeaky shoes weren't a total accident. Some nobles liked them. In a world where your rank was expressed through every detail, how long your sleeves were, how deep you bowed, how many paces you stood from the emperor, it only made sense that someone would find a way to announce their presence with each footfall. Behold, the shoes said, an important person is approaching. You may now gaze respectfully at their ankles. One fringe scholar even suggested that certain squeaky shoes were designed on purpose as passive-aggressive power plays. Imagine trying to deliver a quiet report to the emperor while someone is pacing nearby sounding like a distressed duck. Historians still argue whether these shoes had symbolic meanings or were simply the result of expensive but poorly made imports from far regions of the empire. And let's talk about those imports. The Han were big on trade. The Silk Road was buzzing sometimes, literally if you consider the baskets of live insects that occasionally came with spices and dyes. Exotic goods flowed in, and with them came new types of shoes, often inspired by Central Asian styles. Some of these shoes were sturdier, built for horses and travel. When high-ranking folks started wearing them at court, their clack, clack, clack echoed through marble corridors like a flock of geese refusing to be ignored. The palace wasn't built for noise. Stone floors, high ceilings, long echoing halls. It was practically designed to amplify even the slightest sound. Picture walking into the forbidden chamber at dawn, your shoes betraying you with every step, while around you sit rows of stiff officials, so still you'd think they were wax figures. Each one silently judging your footwear choices like Confucian fashion critics. Now imagine that you're standing before the emperor. Lucha, better known as Emperor Wu of Han, was not a man known for leniency. He reigned for over 50 years and was into expanding the empire, enforcing strict order, and allegedly dabbling in a bit of Taoist magic. The guy probably wouldn't flinch at human sacrifices, but might visibly twitch if your shoe squeaked during a tribute ceremony. To him, noise was disorder. Court rituals were not just politics, they were spiritual. The Han believed in the mandate of heaven, a divine right to rule tied closely to harmony and propriety. And nothing breaks celestial harmony quite like the rubbery squawk of a misplaced step during morning ceremony. Who dares defile the sacred silence of court with this foot fart? Okay, maybe not those exact words, but you get the idea. Even Confucian scholars started weighing in. Sound etiquette became a serious philosophical matter. One treatise notes that the wise man moves with the dignity of still water, which again is not how you're moving with those noisy things strapped to your feet. There's even a quirky bit in an old court document where someone was censured, not exiled, not jailed, just scolded in writing for breaking the tranquility of procession with unseemly sound. That's government HR speak for your shoes are embarrassing us in front of the emperor. Stop it. And yet people kept wearing them. Because humans will always find ways to flaunt status even if it involves auditory sabotage. One theory, maybe squeaky shoes became fashionable for a while. Think of it like the second century version of those flashy sneakers with LED lights. Only hear the lights squeak, and your boss is a semi-divine despot with a flair for celestial omens. The situation became tense enough that multiple palace reforms started cropping up. Officials drew up etiquette manuals for everything bowing, kneeling speaking, and yes, walking. Footfall was now regulated. If your step rhythm was off, or your pace too hurried, you'd be corrected by a stern-eyed attendant with the posture of a brick wall. Your shoes, they had to pass muster too. So here you are, standing in a queue of court officials. Your robes are perfect. Your hair is pinned just right. Your hands folded, your gaze lowered, and your shoes still letting out a mournful weep with every third step. You pray to the ancestors that the emperor is in a good mood today, or at least a little deaf. Spoiler, he's not. You try to shift your weight just right, heel toe, hoping the pressure won't trigger the sound. But there it is again. Squeak! It's like your feet are snitching on you in slow motion, and you can practically feel the temperature in the corridor drop. A eunuch clears his throat somewhere up ahead. Not loudly, just enough for you to hear. Just enough to make your ears burn. It wasn't always like this, though. The history of Chinese footwear starts simple. Hemp rope sandals were common among peasants, sturdy, breathable, and extremely silent unless you were running through bamboo. Nobles and court officials wore soft-soled shoes, often made of silk or fine cloth, dyed in elegant hues that whispered luxury. There was no need for noise when your robe spoke for you. But then came felt leather and wooden soles, sometimes layered with lacquer, for that extra bit of drama. Somewhere along the timeline, the aesthetic turned from quiet grace to audible authority. You weren't just arriving, you were making an entrance. And let's not forget the rise of indoor espionage. You probably didn't expect this story about squeaky shoes to turn into a tale of palace intrigue, but surprise spies walked among the Hanfu-clad elite. You weren't supposed to hear them coming, which is precisely why at a certain point, you could wish, and that was the problem. Some whisper that the squeaky shoes weren't just a fashion misfire. They were part of an early attempt at counter-espionage. Think about it. In an environment where silent movement was prized, those who moved soundlessly could do the most damage. Secret messages, illicit affairs, even attempted poisonings. It said many of these began with a whisper and ended with a near-invisible step across a polished floor. So if someone was squeaking, maybe they weren't the spy. There's an anecdote, quirky, possibly apocryphal, about an empress dowager who once insisted all her personal guards wear the same kind of shoe reinforced with small bamboo inserts that squeaked faintly. Why? So she could always hear where they were. Better to know the tiger is pacing than to wait for the pounce, she reportedly said. Or muttered, or didn't say at all. Historians still argue whether this practice ever became widespread or was just an isolated paranoia-fueled quirk. But the principle stuck in a place where betrayal often came on tiptoe, sound became a twisted form of trust. Meanwhile, you've made it into the inner court. You stop at your designated place in the long line of officials. Everyone stands like statues. You pretend to admire the symmetry of the columns. The floor beneath you is dark jade polished to a mirror sheen. Every breath echoes like you're standing inside a giant ceramic bowl. A young scribe approaches, brush in hand, record scroll tucked under his arm. His footsteps make no sound. None. You wonder what kind of shoes he is wearing. You hate them. Just behind him comes a mid-level official you vaguely recognize. Maybe from the Ministry of Rights, he's got a strut going, clearly enjoying his moment, until you hear it chirp, 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 like a tiny bird nested in each shoe. Your spine goes rigid, so does everyone else's. The sound isn't just annoying, it's suspicious. In a palace that functions on decorum and rank, who dares bring that kind of noise? Every squeak seems to say, "Look at me," which of course is exactly the opposite of what the emperor wants, unless you're holding a tribute of white jade or revealing the secrets of immortality. This is where it gets juicy. Some ministers reportedly started accusing their rivals of intentionally wearing squeaky shoes to disrupt ceremonies and attract attention. No, seriously. This was actual political strategy. You couldn't denounce someone for gossiping, but you could accuse them of footwear misconduct. And there were consequences. The most famous case involved a man named Zhen Shu, an advisor to a regional governor. He showed up to court wearing shoes that made a sound like rubbing two lacquered chopsticks together. Every 5 seconds, skirk. Officials behind him claimed they couldn't concentrate. Some even said it disrupted their bowing rhythm. After 3 warnings and no improvement, Zhen Shu was dismissed for failure to harmonize with ritual proceedings. That's Han code for your shoes ruined everything. Get out. Again, historians still debate whether Zhen Shu was a victim of overly rigid bureaucracy or just a noisy nuisance. Either way, his story was preserved not for any policy insight, but as a footwear cautionary tale. Shoes weren't just about foot protection. They were now part of an elaborate court persona, interwoven with everything from your voice pitch to your robe color. Some designs became associated with loyalty, others with vanity. Some were even rumored to signal political affiliations, like if your shoe had 3 embroidery knots instead of 2, that meant you supported the prime minister. Or maybe you just had a stylish aunt. Who knows? You glance down at your own shoes. They look plain enough. Cloth uppers, leather soles, traditional stitching. But inside, you know the truth. One of the cork pads came loose last week, and now you've got a subtle but deadly chirp on the left side. You should have fixed it. You meant to. But now here you are praying to every deity you can name that your feet don't call out in treason. The eunuchs have noticed. Of course they have. You catch one watching you from the side, head-tilted expression unreadable. These men may be soft-voiced and smooth-stepping, but their memory is iron. If your name ends up in their morning report, you might not get another chance to embarrass yourself. It's strange, isn't it, that something so minor, so silly, squeaky shoes, could carry the weight of ritual fear and political consequence. But in the Han court, where every element was orchestrated to uphold the dignity of rule, the smallest discord could unravel everything. A misplaced word could be sedition, a poorly timed bow could be arrogance, and your shoes, they spoke before your mouth ever did. And right now, yours are telling everyone that you don't belong here. You hold your breath, adjusting your stance in microscopic increments, trying to find that mystical sweet spot where your left shoe doesn't squeak. Maybe if you lean forward just a hair nope, that was worse. Now it sounds like you stepped on a damp duck. The court official beside you twitches. You can't even see his eyes, but you feel the disapproval radiating from beneath his neatly folded hat. You're not alone. Every single person here is hyper-aware of sound. The Han Imperial Court, especially during Emperor Wu's reign, is less a governing body and more an elite theater company, one where every performance is expected to be flawless and silent. Think of the court like a high-stakes ASMR session, soft voices, measured gestures, the faint rustle of silk, the crisp brush of parchment. It's not just ambiance, it's power. You're standing in a room where silence is the language, and breaking it without purpose is like shouting profanity during a meditation class. It's no accident. Han Dynasty rulers saw themselves as celestial intermediaries. Every decision they made was supposed to mirror the divine order of the universe. The court was a cosmic stage, and sound, especially uninvited sound, signaled disharmony. It was more than annoying. It was potentially ominous. Some texts suggest that unusual noises during court ceremonies were interpreted as bad omens. Squeaky shoes, creaking, scroll tables, even coughing. During important announcements, these were all seen as cosmic warning signs. Something is off. Something is not aligned. You didn't just annoy your superior. You might have triggered a small existential crisis for the entire state. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were sincerely held or just used as excuses to punish people the court didn't like. Either way, no one wanted to be the cause of that uncomfortable silence that follows a spontaneous shoe shriek. But how did squeaky shoes end up in the middle of all this celestial choreography? Turns out power doesn't just walk quietly, it evolves. In the earlier Western Zhou period, several centuries before the Han court, rituals were noisy affairs. Bells, chimes, drums, they were big on sound as a way to reinforce hierarchy. But by the time of the Han, the imperial court had grown more sophisticated and quiet, had become the new loud. By contrast, any unexpected sound was chaos incarnate. That's how the Han court became a place where you could literally weaponize silence. And then someone went and wore noisy shoes. At first, it's just seen as an inconvenience. Please, the etiquette manuals imply stop sounding like you're stepping on frogs during the Jade Seal ceremony, but over time the problem deepens. The palace starts to suspect that people want you to squeak, that they're doing it on purpose, drawing attention, stirring disorder, challenging the balance of things. You remember the whisper stories of officials accused of using their shoes to signal secret messages. 3 squeaks meant proceed with the plan. 2 squeaks and a stomp, abort. Fringe theory. Sure. But when you're constantly paranoid that the guy behind you might be plotting your downfall, every sound becomes suspicious. And the court was nothing if not a boiling pot of suspicion with a dragon-shaped lid. One oddly specific account from the Han Shu. Yes, that's the Book of Han. Our go-to drama journal mentions a court servant who modified his sandals to include tiny hollow reeds that made a faint warbling sound when he walked. He claimed it was for arch support. He was executed for auditory subversion. Make of that what you will. You shuffle your feet again, carefully, deliberately, and still you get the tiniest high-pitched weak. That's it. You decide not to move again until this ceremony ends, even if your legs go numb and your spine fuses into a question mark. To distract yourself, you observe the other officials. Most are standing as still as carved stone, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. But there's a subtle dance happening. Small shifts, a clearing of the throat, a slight brush of sleeve over scroll. Everyone is communicating in silences and non-gestures. Then your eye catches one of the inner ministers walking down the corridor. His steps are perfect, smooth, inaudible. He glides like a ghost on polished jade. You hate him too. It's possible he's wearing shoes made from deer hide. A favorite of certain upper-tier ministers. The material is famously quiet when treated correctly, soft enough to absorb step impacts, supple enough to hold shape. But deer hide is expensive and rare and has to be sourced from specific regions during specific seasons. Naturally, it becomes the footwear of choice for those who care very much about being noticed for not making noise. Meanwhile, you remember trying to negotiate your own shoes from the city's third-best cobbler. You could have gone with the rice straw insole model, but no, you picked the stitched leather pair with double-padded heels because they looked important. Big mistake. Your feet are now a pair of guilty clarinets. The court attendants begin arranging scrolls and stepping aside. The emperor is approaching, or rather, he's about to be revealed. Because Han emperors don't just walk in, they're unveiled like celestial paintings come to life. A soft bell chimes. Everyone drops to one knee, heads bow. Except you. Your foot catches awkwardly. Your knee bends just a hair too slow. Squeak. It echoes. Even in the bowed silence, you hear it bounce off the marble. It's a lonely little sound. It almost sounds scared. You envy it. The official in front of you clenches his fists. The eunuch scribes murmur something into their sleeves. The emperor doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. His silence has more gravity than your entire salary. And in that moment, it becomes abundantly clear you have broken the harmony. Not with a betrayal, not with a lie, with your shoes. Later, maybe someone will tell the story differently. Maybe they'll say the wind blew oddly, that the floors were slick, that you were caught off guard, but they'll all remember the sound. That one tiny squeak during the moment of divine presence. Congratulations, you are now part of history. You don't dare look up. Not because you're afraid of the emperor's face, honestly, you've only seen it from a respectful distance once. And even then, it was more of a glowing silhouette surrounded by embroidered dragons. No, you keep your eyes fixed on the floor because you're trying to remember how to breathe. That one little squeak, barely a fraction of a second now, lives rent-free in your soul. The room remains utterly still. Too still. You can hear someone's robes shifting 3 bodies over. Then nothing. The silence is so heavy you almost feel gravity get jealous. A eunuch steps forward to unroll a ceremonial scroll. The sound it makes, soft parchment sliding against itself, is like a full orchestra compared to your accidental solo. You want to crawl under the floor tiles, And this, you realize, is what the Han court had been trying to avoid all along: the jarring interruption of unplanned sound in a world obsessed with order. Back in the early Han period, silence was the rhythm that kept everyone in sync. The court operated like a music box, delicate, winding, intricate. Each step, bow, phrase, even the angle of your wrist when saluting, had its place in a larger choreography. Noise outside that script, it wasn't just annoying, it was threatening. In fact, there was once an entire treatise written on palace acoustics, possibly by a Confucian scholar named Chi Tan, where he described the harmony of governance as being like the rhythm of a perfect ritual. His more obscure writings, which may or may not be real, historians still argue whether Chi Tan was a single person or just a name slapped on etiquette manuals, mention the importance of oral balance in court spaces. Chi Tan, or whoever claimed that disharmony in sound reflected disharmony in state affairs. He even went as far as recommending special materials for the palace floors: aged pine-polished slate and lacquered stone, each chosen for their resonance, or rather their lack of it. Which means your squeaky leathercloth combo, a sonic middle finger to Confucian ideals. There was even an attempt at one point to standardize his shoe production for court officials. Some believe it started under Emperor Jing, who apparently had a very sensitive ear, and once cut an audience short because a minister's heels made a clicking noise when he turned. A proposal was drafted that outlined acceptable shoe construction, soft inner soles, muted colors, and a quiet step guarantee. Okay, maybe it didn't say that exactly, but you get the idea. It wasn't just about avoiding embarrassment, it was about the illusion of serenity. Han rulers were obsessed with projecting cosmic legitimacy. Everything around them needed to reflect the universe in perfect order. Squeaky shoes. That was like putting a whoopee cushion in the middle of a solar eclipse. Which brings you to a particularly odd footnote in this saga: the Great Slipper Conspiracy of 113 BCE. You've probably never heard of it, most people haven't, but there's a fringe theory that a group of mid-level courtiers tried to undermine a rival by sneaking small slivers of dry bamboo into his shoes. The inserts made them squeak just enough to get him noticed and reprimanded during a key tribute presentation. No one was executed, but someone did end up reassigned to a horsehair inspection post along the northern frontier. The emperor called it auditory sabotage. It didn't help that the victim reportedly wept while being exiled, causing his shoes to squelch. That detail lives on in a comedic mural somewhere near Luoyang, though scholars still argue whether that's satire or ancient bullying preserved in brushstrokes. And yet in the present moment, none of that helps you. The emperor finally speaks. His voice is soft, low measured. You don't understand every word. His dialect is ancient and laced with ceremonial phrases, but you pick up enough. He's praising the harvest, thanking the ancestors, requesting stability from the stars. The kind of phrases that make you feel smaller than a sesame seed and twice as irrelevant. But you listen. You listen like your life depends on it, because it might. The ceremony continues, and for a moment the attention drifts from you. The ministers recite invocations, the eunuchs distribute offerings. The silence returns, but this time it wraps around the room like a thick blanket, muffling your anxiety. Maybe it's over. Maybe your tiny sonic crime has been forgotten. Then the imperial gaze turns your way. You don't see it, you feel it, like standing in front of the sun with your eyes shut. You bow again perfectly this time. The movement is fluid, slow, dignified, no squeak. Your shoe, thank every ancient spirit imaginable, stays quiet. It learned its lesson. The emperor gestures. One of his attendants steps forward. A parchment is unrolled. Names are read. Yours isn't first, but it is on the list. You've been summoned for review, a formal audience. Great. This wasn't part of your plan today. You were supposed to stand there invisible, contribute nothing disruptive, and leave with your dignity intact. Instead, your footwear launched you into an entirely new orbit of scrutiny. As you're led toward the dais, you consider faking an injury. Maybe your ankle gave out. Maybe the humidity warped your shoes. Maybe you were cursed by a disgruntled cobbler who mistook you for someone else. Any excuse to explain the earlier sound. You say nothing, of course, because in the Han court, the wrong excuse is just as fatal as no excuse at all. As you walk, you pass under an archway decorated with dragons. Their mouths open in silent roars, tongues curled like question marks. One of them seems to be staring right at your feet. Judgmental reptile. But you walk well, Quietly, carefully, no squeaks. By the time you reach the emperor's dais, you've convinced yourself the earlier noise wasn't that loud. Maybe it didn't echo that far. Maybe it got lost under the scroll rustle. Maybe you're not the main character in this mess after all. Still, as you bow once more, you can't help but imagine the official scribes noting it down. Third bell of harmony, official from the Ministry of Works summoned. Footwear produced noise inconsistent with ritual tone. Investigation pending. Your legacy might just be that guy with the wrong shoes. You stand in the hall, heart pounding like a taiko drum in a festival, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes watching you, like you just showed up in flip-flops at a silk robe gala. The emperor's court is not a place for clumsy mistakes, especially those that break the invisible code of conduct, woven as tightly as the emperor's own robes. The eunuch escorts you closer, his polished shoes silent on the marble floor. You realize your own feet sound like a barnyard chorus of squeaks and clanks. You swallow your nerves and prepare to answer for your footwear's crimes. The emperor's eyes glint with something unreadable, perhaps curiosity, perhaps amusement, or a trace of irritation. This moment reminds you why court life is often described as a game of shadows and whispers. Every move counts and missteps can echo louder than 1,000 cheers or curses. You recall the official decree issued just a year prior, the Han Dynasty's ban on squeaky shoes in court. It wasn't just a fashion rule or etiquette tip. It was a decree born out of the belief that noise disrupted the harmony between heaven and earth, a belief so serious it shaped court protocol to an almost obsessive degree. Historians still argue whether this was an earnest superstition or a political tool to enforce discipline, but regardless, the ban was strictly enforced. Shoemakers who crafted offending footwear could lose their licenses. Officials caught wearing noisy shoes risked demotion or worse. You try to imagine the origin of this law. Perhaps it started after an incident during a major court ritual. Maybe an emperor was distracted by a squeaky shoe at a critical moment, seen as a bad omen, a threat to the celestial mandate that kept the empire stable. Some fringe scholars even suggest a conspiracy behind the ban, a secret society within the court that used sound, specifically the absence or presence of it, as a method of control, turning noise into a subtle weapon in the game of power. That afternoon, as you're interrogated about your footwear, you learn more about the lengths the court went to maintain this acoustic illusion. Court attendants even used thin layers of lotus fiber underfloor padding to absorb unwanted sounds, and silk slippers were favored for their near silence. One intriguing anecdote involves a favorite minister of Emperor Wu, known for his exceptional ability to move silently, earning the nickname the Ghost Walker. Some say he practiced walking barefoot on pebbles to perfect his stealth, embodying the ideal of quiet dignity the emperor revered. You can't help but chuckle at that image. Imagine a high-ranking official tiptoeing around like a ninja, but in heavy silk robes and a dignified hat. But quiet as the court might have tried to be, human nature proved persistent. Officials whispered, conspirators plotted, and sometimes the occasional squeak slipped through the cracks. Sometimes accidentally, sometimes deliberately. You start to see the ban as less about the sound and more about control of attention, control of perception, control of who gets to be seen and heard in the grand theater of imperial politics. And here you are, unwittingly cast as the loudest player of all. You shuffle awkwardly in front of the emperor, your mind racing faster than the footsteps that brought you here. The court is alive with hushed murmurs and the faintest scrape of silk on marble, a stark contrast to the loud squeaking that betrayed you moments ago. The silence is deliberate, a woven web designed to amplify even the tiniest disruption, and your squeaky shoes have become a thunderclap. You remember reading about Emperor Wu's personal disdain for unnecessary noise in court. This wasn't mere etiquette, it was a statement of cosmic order. The emperor believed that every sound should reflect the harmony of the heavens, and any discordant noise was a sign of chaos creeping into the realm. That's why he banned squeaky shoes, because they literally made a mockery of his carefully constructed silence. Historians still argue whether Emperor Wu's ban was rooted in superstition or political strategy. Some think it was a way to keep officials on edge, making sure they were constantly aware that even the smallest misstep, literal or figurative, could bring them trouble. Others see it as part of the broader Confucian ideal of order and decorum. As you stand there, you notice the emperor's gaze linger on your feet, almost amused. Maybe he sees you as an innocent victim of fate, or perhaps as a cautionary example. The officials around you are stone-faced, but you can feel the tension in the room like a low hum beneath the surface. The emperor speaks softly, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of an empire. He asks if you understand the importance of silence and the symbolism of quiet steps in maintaining the harmony of the court. You nod, too stunned to do anything else. Then comes the question no one wants to hear. Why did your shoes squeak? You recall the cobbler's shop in the marketplace, the cheap leather, the unseasoned soles. You had no idea that such a minor choice could lead to this moment. You stammer an apology explaining that it was unintentional, a mistaken judgment. The emperor nods thoughtfully, then gestures to one of the attendants who brings forth a pair of soft deer-hide slippers. Wear these, the emperor says, and remember in court every step must be as silent as the stars. You slip into the slippers, their softness a balm to your embarrassed feet. The squeak is gone. The court feels different now, less like a trap, more like a stage set for a delicate dance where silence is the music. You realize that the ban on squeaky shoes was never just about footwear. It was about the power of sound and silence, about control and symbolism, about the invisible rules that govern not just a court, but an entire empire. As you leave the hall, you catch whispers of other officials' similar mishaps, some subtle, some disastrous. The ban on squeaky shoes becomes a metaphor for the fragile balance of power in the Han Dynasty, a reminder that even the smallest sound can echo across history. You wander the palace corridors, your steps now cushioned by the soft deer-hide slippers, but your mind still buzzing with the awkward echo of your earlier squeak. The hallways themselves seem almost alive, walls embroidered with intricate murals, ceilings painted with clouds and dragons that seem to chase each other endlessly. Every sound here is measured, muted, like the whole place is holding its breath. And frankly, you're not sure if it's the slipper's softness or your own nerves that make your steps feel so light. You remember something odd you once read about Han Dynasty footwear. Apparently, some officials preferred shoes lined with silk, infused with fragrant herbs like sandalwood or jasmine. The idea was that if you had to be noticed, you'd at least smell pleasant while being silent. A quirky tidbit, but it speaks volumes about the court's obsession with sensory control, not just sound, but scent too. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or just a luxury for a few favored courtiers, but the fact that it even existed highlights how deeply ritual permeated every inch of palace life. As you stroll, you overhear whispers about the infamous Silent Shoes Bureau, a department supposedly dedicated to inspecting and approving every pair of shoes worn in court. While official records are scarce, rumor has it, they employed shoe specialists and acousticians, people who could tell if a heel clicked too loudly or a sole was too rigid. It sounds absurd until you recall your own squeaky disaster. There's even talk of silent shoe patrols, officials tasked with roaming the palace corridors, listening for unauthorized noises and reporting offenders. It's like something out of a spy novel, except the weapon of choice was a well-timed toe tap. You pause by a quiet courtyard where plum blossoms drop their delicate petals onto stone pathways. The contrast between the natural world's spontaneous noise, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the enforced silence inside the palace walls hits you hard. It's a reminder that human control over sound is always ultimately an attempt to bend chaos into order. You begin to understand why the Han Dynasty's ban on squeaky shoes wasn't just about sound. It was about power, the power to dictate how people moved, how they presented themselves, how they participated in the grand narrative of the empire. And yet, the more you think about it, the more you realize how fragile that power really was. One squeak, one misstep, and the illusion of control could shatter. You smile to yourself, imagining a future archaeologist unearthing a squeaky shoe and puzzling over its significance centuries from now. Will they understand the court's obsession, or will it just sound like a funny footnote? As you continue your quiet walk, the palace's silence wraps around you like a velvet cloak. You tread lightly, mindful that in this world, even a whisper of sound can speak volumes. You find yourself in the grand library, a cool sanctuary where scrolls and bamboo slips are stacked like silent sentinels. The faint smell of aged paper and ink mingles with the subtle scent of sandalwood from a nearby incense burner. It's quiet here, perfect, for pondering the curious decree about squeaky shoes. You settle on a wooden bench, tracing the ornate carvings with your fingertips. Somewhere nearby, a scholar murmurs to himself, turning pages with the care of handling ancient bones. In your mind's ear, you replay the stories you've gathered so far, The emperor's obsession with sound, the secretive shoe inspectors, the silent shoes bureau. But there's more beneath the surface. The ban on squeaky shoes was part of a larger campaign to control not just court etiquette, but the very narrative of power. You recall that historians still argue whether the decree was rooted in superstition, perhaps an ancient belief that disruptive sounds could anger the gods, or if it was a political move designed to keep officials on edge, constantly policing themselves and one another. Interestingly, some fringe historians propose that the ban was also a practical matter of security. A noisy shoe might betray the approach of a spy or an assassin. The palace, after all, was a hotbed of intrigue with factions vying for influence and survival. You find a scroll detailing an incident from the reign of Emperor Wu, an attempted assassination foiled because a would-be attacker's squeaky shoes gave him away. The emperor reportedly decreed after that event that silence is the first shield of the throne. This opens a whole new angle: sound as a weapon or a warning system. It's almost poetic, the idea that something as trivial as a squeaky shoe could be the difference between life and death. You also stumble upon references to the soundscape of the court, a concept describing how the careful orchestration of silence and sound was integral to maintaining imperial authority. The court's acoustics were engineered to amplify certain noises, like the emperor's voice, and suppress others. On a whim, you try to mimic the steps of a courtier heel, tapping lightly on the polished floor. The sound seems to echo in your ears, reminding you how the acoustics shape the experience of power. Even the slightest noise can signal status or treachery. You think back to your own earlier misstep, how your squeaky shoes pierced that carefully curated silence. It was a small rebellion against order, a crack in the polished veneer of authority. But what's perhaps most fascinating is how this obsession with sound reflects a deeper human truth: the desire to control perception. The emperor didn't just want to rule through law or force. He wanted to rule through experience, shaping how his court, and by extension, his empire, felt to those inside it. And so the ban on squeaky shoes becomes more than a footnote. It's a symbol of the intricate dance between power perception and control that defined the Han Dynasty's golden age. You sit back, letting the silence of the library seep into your bones, realizing that sometimes the quietest stories are the loudest. You drift out of the library, the quiet weight of ancient knowledge lingering like a gentle fog around you. The palace corridors feel different now, like a living organism breathing softly in the stillness. Each step you take in those silent slippers reminds you of the unseen forces that shape the empire's soundscape. Your thoughts wander to the social rituals tied to footwear. In the Han Dynasty, shoes weren't just practical, they were symbols of rank and identity. The higher your status, the more elaborate and carefully crafted your shoes had to be, and the quieter. A noble's shoes whispered silk and soft leather, while a low-ranking servant's might betray them with a harsh, clunky tread. Historians still argue how much these shoe codes enforce social hierarchy versus simply reflecting it. But there's no doubt that the ban on squeaky shoes fit neatly into this system. Silence was power, and power was silence. You recall a curious detail: some officials would even soften their footsteps by wrapping cloth around their shoes or patting their soles with moss. This obsession created an entire culture around the sound of walking, an art form, almost a performance. It's as if every step taken in the court was part of a silent ballet. One fringe theory suggests that these rituals around silent shoes might have evolved from ancient shamanistic practices, where noise, or the lack of it, was believed to influence spiritual realms. The emperor's court, after all, was not just a political center, but also a sacred space connecting earth to heaven. You can't help but smile at the thought. Imagine a whole entourage of courtiers tiptoeing around like ghosts, each step laden with ritual and meaning. The palace wouldn't be a place of power and politics. It would be a stage for a quiet symphony of footsteps. And yet, despite the seriousness, there was humor in it too. There's a surviving anecdote about an overly nervous official whose shoes squeaked so loudly he was nicknamed the singing shoes for life, an embarrassment that followed him like a persistent echo. You wonder about the human side of all this: the pressure, the anxiety, the lengths people went to just to avoid a squeak. It wasn't just about shoes, it was about survival, reputation, and sometimes sheer self-preservation. As you pass a group of young servants practicing silent walking, their whispered laughter betrays their efforts to master this delicate skill. It's a reminder that beneath the weight of empire and history, people are people awkward, striving, sometimes stumbling. In the end, the ban on squeaky shoes isn't just a strange decree. It's a window into the lives and fears of those who lived under the Han Dynasty's watchful gaze, trying their best to navigate a world where even a shoe's squeak could change their fate. You step out into the inner palace garden just as twilight begins to paint the sky in soft ribbons of gold and lavender. The stillness here feels different, more natural, more forgiving. Cicadas hum gently in the background, and the koi in the pond ripple the surface like silk sleeves brushing a drumhead. For once, sound isn't an offense, but a conversation with the world. Yet even here, your thoughts circle back to shoes. The gardens were one of the few places where courtiers could momentarily loosen the rigid grip of court protocol. And yet, even in these semi-private spaces, the Han Dynasty's obsession with silent movement clung like a second skin. You imagine ministers strolling between plum trees, careful not to let a footfall betray them. The etiquette manuals of the time, yes, those existed, warned against vulgar footsteps, a euphemism for any sound too loud, too fast, or too obvious. Historians still argue whether these guides were meant to instill discipline or simply reflect existing norms. Either way, they reveal a society that took walking very, very seriously. There was a right way to move, a right speed, even a right tempo. Like music, court life followed an invisible score, and anyone out of sync risked discord and dismissal. One particularly fascinating detail: there were entire rehearsals for ceremonial walking, practice sessions, time drills, court functionaries trained to enter a room in perfect unison, their feet brushing the ground as lightly as wind across parchment. It sounds absurd until you consider the spectacle of the imperial court, a space where image and perception were everything. You pass under a pergola of trailing wisteria, its blossoms heavy with fragrance, and think about the man credited with elevating these walking rituals to an art form, Dongfang Shuo, a famed court jester and scholar during Emperor Wu's reign. Dong was both a favorite and a nuisance, brilliant with words but mischievous with formality. One fringe story claims he once mocked the silent walking rules by strapping tiny bells to his shoes during a banquet. The court froze horrified, but Emperor Wu allegedly laughed, amused by the audacity. Dong avoided punishment, but the incident supposedly inspired stricter enforcement afterward. No more jokes. Silence was sacred. You imagine being in that room, the quiet tension, the shock, the emperor's single chuckle breaking the mood like a teacup hitting stone. It's a perfect snapshot of the paradoxes in Han court life, rigid yet theatrical, humorless, yet full of behind-the-scenes jests. And it wasn't just about walking either. Sound, when permitted, was carefully curated. Instruments were played only at designated times. Bells and chimes signaled transitions in ceremony. You start to see squeaky shoes not as trivial annoyances, but as intrusions into a curated sensory universe, like a cell phone ringing during a string quartet. Which brings you to another undercurrent one. Historians rarely agree on whether the squeaky shoe ban was aimed more at officials or at eunuchs. Some records suggest eunuchs were especially targeted, perhaps because they moved most often between chambers and were seen as disruptors of the sacred hush. Others believe eunuchs, known for their refined dress and etiquette, were the silent gold standard. In any case, it's clear that footsteps weren't just noise, they were narrative. A man's walk told you about his rank, his mood, even his intentions. Silent slippers meant calm control. Squeaky soles could suggest carelessness, arrogance, or worst of all, unworthiness. You glance down at your own quiet feet, aware now of the story they're telling. Here in the garden, the world is momentarily softer, but the legacy of the silent step remains. You find your way back inside just as lanterns flicker to life, their amber glow dancing across lacquered wood and embroidered drapes. The hallways are quieter now, but not empty, just hushed as though the walls themselves are listening. You walk a little more slowly, not because you're tired, but because you're beginning to savor the stillness to understand it. Your thoughts shift to the people who made this silence possible, not the nobles or the officials, but the craftsmen. It's easy to overlook them tucked away in workshops, far from the grand court. But these artisans played a crucial role in shaping the very steps of history. Quite literally, the finest shoemakers of the Han Dynasty were revered not just for their craftsmanship, but for their discretion. They knew that a single pair of shoes could raise or ruin reputations. Some shoemakers were rumored to have signature methods for silencing soles, layering rare leathers, stuffing midsoles with crushed mulberry bark, or applying heated wax to smooth out squeak-prone seams. And while mainstream historical records mention shoemaking guilds and court-approved patterns, fringe accounts speak of ghost shoes, pairs so quiet they were supposedly blessed by monks. Historians still argue whether these shoemakers had real influence or were simply convenient scapegoats when things went wrong, but some suggest they acted almost like tailors of behavior, silent partners in the performance of status. You imagine one such craftsman stooped over his tools late at night, testing a sole by walking in slow circles over lacquered floorboards. Not a creak, not a whisper. Only then would he nod in satisfaction, and only then could the shoes be deemed fit for the imperial court. What's particularly intriguing is the black market that rose up around these coveted shoes. Yes, there was an illicit trade in unauthorized footwear. You can't help but chuckle at the idea of shadowy figures trading hush-heeled slippers in moonlit alleyways, muttering about two-squeak defects and temple-grade stitching. Some even faked the palace-approved stamp, a tiny gold thread character sewn into the lining of official court shoes. Getting caught wearing counterfeit footwear was no laughing matter, though penalties ranged from demotion to, in extreme cases, flogging. You picture a high-ranking minister losing his post not because of corruption, but because his left shoe wheezed during a seasonal banquet. You pause near a tall folding screen painted with cranes and pine trees. A servant slips past behind it, so quiet you wouldn't have noticed if not for the faint scent of oiled silk. That's the thing you realize. In this world, silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was an achievement, something earned, practiced, perfected. And it wasn't limited to shoes. The entire court system was built on layers of silence. Speech was regulated, expressions were controlled. Even gestures followed strict protocols. One wrong look, one poorly timed breath, and your career could nosedive faster than a drop scroll. So the silent shoe wasn't an oddity, it was part of a broader culture of controlled visibility, a way of disappearing in plain sight, of asserting presence through absence, which, if you think about it, is kind of brilliant in a maddening bureaucratic sort of way. You lean against a column for a moment, feeling the coolness of the stone seep through your robe. From somewhere deep in the palace, you hear a faint tap, someone practicing court protocol maybe, or just trying out a new pair of slippers. You smile. In a world that feared the squeak, every quiet step was an act of grace, or defiance, or both. The palace is beginning to doze now, not quite asleep, but easing into that delicate twilight hum, where the day's formality gives way to whispers and glances. You meander down a side corridor lined with portraits, stylized figures in flowing robes, their expressions caught somewhere between dignity and discomfort, as though even the ink feared missteps. Tonight your mind fixates on enforcement, not the rule but how it was maintained. After all, a ban on squeaky shoes sounds simple enough until you realize someone had to actually listen for violations. Enter the patrollers of silence. You spot a set of records surprisingly intact that detail the duties of palace conduct monitors. These officials weren't soldiers or guards, they were listeners. Their ears were their weapons. Stationed near ceremonial halls, throne rooms, and even the emperor's private chambers, their job was to identify sound outliers, coughs during speech, accidental sighs, and yes, forbidden footwear. Historians still argue whether these monitors were respected officials or reviled tattletales, but their presence definitely contributed to the culture of hypervigilance. Imagine knowing that someone was listening not just to what you said, but to how you stepped. One particularly vivid account from the reign of Emperor Chung tells of a senior advisor who lost his rank because his sandal hissed like a frightened goose during an imperial poetry recital. You don't know whether to feel bad for him or for the goose. And the consequences, often subtle at first, a missed invitation, a cold glance, then maybe a transfer to a less visible post, or worse, a formal reprimand inscribed forever in your bureaucratic dossier. Of course, not everyone took it lying down. One fringe tale tells of a rebellious junior clerk who, fed up with the silence patrols, began intentionally making bird calls, with his shoes mimicking owls and sparrows as he walked. He was exiled, obviously, but for a few weeks he became a folk hero to the lower servants. This undercurrent of resistance fascinates you. For every decree, there's always someone pushing back, whether out of boredom ideology or sheer mischief. And then there's the matter of shoe inspections. Yes, actual inspections. Court attire checks were routine, but shoes became a special focus. Officials had to submit them for evaluation prior to major events. A squeaky sole could be detected by trained listeners in echo chambers, basically tiled rooms with acoustics designed to magnify even the tiniest creak. You picture it, a row of nervous ministers standing barefoot in the corner while their shoes are tested like musical instruments. A little knock here, a twist there. The examiner leaning in, squinting like a sommelier, sniffing for bad tannins. These inspections weren't just about functionality, they were about symbolism. Footwear represented grounding, how you carried yourself literally and socially. An unstable shoe was interpreted as an unstable character. Too loud and you might be labeled attention-seeking or improperly trained. Too soft and someone might suspect you of hiding something. It was a lose-lose foot game. You brush past a heavy curtain and enter what looks like an antechamber for court musicians. Strange, isn't it? In a place where sound was curated so fiercely, musicians were the only ones allowed to break the silence. But even they had rules. Drum beats had to be muted, plucks delicate. Shoes were always removed before entering a performance space. The irony, music flourished, but footsteps were forbidden to sing. The silence here, then, wasn't natural, it was constructed, engineered. And the ban on squeaky shoes was just one pillar in a temple of performance, where every breath and blink was part of a stage show designed to maintain cosmic balance and imperial control. You think back to your own first steps through these halls, how loud they felt, how small, and how now, after everything, you walk not just more quietly, but more consciously. The moon has edged higher now, casting slender beams across the tiled roofs and silk banners. Somewhere deep in the imperial residence, a chime signals the changing of the night watch. You pause by a set of winding stairs that lead up to the archival tower, a place where only the most diligent scribes and the most scandal-averse historians ever dared to spend their nights. Tonight you're climbing them. Step by step, the wooden staircase creaks faintly beneath you, not loud, but just enough to remind you that you are still part of this world, still a body, not a ghost. It's oddly comforting. Up here in the archives, the air smells of aged parchment, soot, and secrets. Scrolls and bamboo slips sit in perfect silence, holding decades of judgment, praise, instructions, and sometimes gossip dressed up as policy. You find a curious record, a stack of memoranda marked with cinnabar ink. The subject, behavioral anomalies attributed to auditory disruptions in court decorum. In other words, what happened when someone's shoes squeaked. One particularly juicy report outlines the downfall of a promising vice minister whose heel whistled during a memorial tribute. The squeak came just as he bowed. The room froze. He tried to cough to cover it, made it worse. The emperor didn't react, at least not openly, but 3 weeks later the man was reassigned to a border post so remote that camels refused to go there. Historians still argue whether this reassignment was punishment for the squeak or simply a political reshuffle. Either way, the court took notes, and the message was clear: silence wasn't just etiquette, it was insurance. But the most fascinating part, how this silence transformed over time. You see, later Han rulers, notably during the Eastern, Han began to soften the squeaky shoe doctrine. Whether due to shifting philosophy, budget constraints, or just pure exhaustion, some emperors relaxed the rule. There's a curious record of Emperor Zhang granting leniency to a foreign envoy whose clunky boots disrupted an entire ceremony. Rather than punishing him, the emperor laughed and supposedly said, "Let all know even heaven has thunder." A poetic loophole, perhaps. Or maybe he just didn't care for another scandal over footwear. This leads you to a quirky fringe account never officially verified of a prank pulled during the New Year audience. It's said that a low-ranking attendant attached tiny bells inside the shoes of several elite ministers. As they walked, their footsteps sang, "Beautiful, yes. Appropriate, not even slightly." The court was aghast. The emperor apparently loved it. He had the bells confiscated, but rewarded the ministers for their poise under auditory attack. It makes you think maybe the purpose of these rules wasn't really about maintaining order, but about testing grace under pressure. A squeak was a crack in the mask, a moment of unguarded humanity in a world obsessed with appearances. As you move past the rows of record boxes, you spot an older entry, one that attempts to codify silence in the context of heavenly law. It describes sound as a function of moral harmony. The quieter the court, the more aligned with cosmic rhythm. But then in a tiny footnote, a nameless scribe had scrawled, "Yet what of truth that walks loudly?" That question lingers. The ban on squeaky shoes wasn't just about noise, it was about control, predictability. It filtered out the accidental, the unplanned, the real. In a court where every move was choreographed, silence kept the dance from falling apart. You lean against a bamboo scroll rack, eyes heavy, but thoughts awake. You followed this story from decree to defiance, from artist into emperor, from footsteps to philosophies. And still the quiet endures. Because sometimes silence isn't absence, it's presence refined. You descend the archive tower slowly, your fingertips grazing the rail, your steps consciously light. Not because you're afraid of squeaking, but because you now understand why they feared it so much. At the base of the stairwell, you find yourself in one of the inner gardens, moonlight washing over lotus ponds and miniature bridges, like silk poured from a bowl. A pair of palace cats dart past you, silent, unbothered, the true masters of noiseless movement. And this is where it all comes together. The ban on squeaky shoes wasn't just about squeaky shoes. It was about everything that squeaks. The unexpected, the unfiltered, the human. You walk the gravel path now with the measured grace of someone who's seen behind the curtain. Every rustle of your robe, every press of your soul feels deliberate, like you're not walking through the past but through its memory of itself. You pass a statue of a former empress, known more for her reforms than her footwear, and remember a tidbit you read back in the archives. She reportedly designed her own noiseless slippers by layering rice paper between hemp insoles. It worked, but they disintegrated in rain. Still a poetic failure. Some scholars believe that these strictures, the quiet, walking, the mute gestures, the facial restraint formed a language of their own. A semiotic system, they call it, where silence was not a void but a statement. 1,000 unspoken things compressed into a single quiet step. Historians still argue whether this silent language helped preserve unity or simply made the court more paranoid. The answer probably lies somewhere in between. But maybe that was the point, that everything had to look perfect so that the empire felt perfect. That if your footsteps didn't scream, neither would the cracks in your policies. That if the floors stayed quiet, perhaps the people would too. You reach the old ceremonial hall one last time now, dark and vast and echoing only with the sound of your breath. You walk its length, slowly imagining the years, centuries of feet that tread this same path, whispering in silk, worried about every scuff, every scrape, every tiny betrayal of composure. And in this final stretch of silence, you realize they weren't just afraid of squeaky shoes. They were afraid of being noticed when they didn't want to be. Afraid of the attention a squeak demands, the heads that turn, the eyes that narrow, the questions that follow. And in a court of mask, scrutiny could be fatal. So they walked quietly. They ruled quietly. They plotted, punished, and praised, all quietly. Because in the Han Dynasty, the loudest thing you could be wasn't a rebel or a liar or even a traitor. It was squeaky. And squeaky didn't last long. And now your feet stop moving. You settle into stillness as the garden fades behind you, as if folding itself back into its own soft history. The hush feels heavier now, but not oppressive, just whole, as though silence, once strange, has become a kind of friend. You take a deep breath longer than the last. The air is cooler, softer on your skin, wrapped in the night's gentle rhythm. The Han court, with all its rituals and whisperings, begins to feel far away now. The sandals, the hush, the patrolling ears. They dissolve like a mist lifting from stone, leaving behind only the idea of them, gentle and distant. Maybe you're still walking those palace corridors in your dreams robes, brushing the floor, always one step ahead of the next echo. Or maybe tonight you get to rest finally quietly, knowing you've seen something few people get to see, not just how the world was ruled, but how that rule sounded, or didn't. Or let your mind wander now, just a little. Let the stories blur at the edges like ink in water. Let the last soft footfall fall away. You've walked a long way through silence. Now it's time to sleep in it.